Hi everyone, my name is Jessica Kaninsky, and today we are going to be going over some ethics in media. This is my audience. So, the first category I wanted to cover was aiding law enforcement, or knowing when to say when, drawing the line at cooperating with authorities. So, some unethical acts in that story that they ran were the authorities trying to inhibit the freedom of speech and the freedom of press by not letting them run the story about the threat to the president they received. So the type of unethical act that it was privacy. Authorities shouldn't have the ability to keep things like presidential threats private in a town because in the text it says, and I quote, according to the testimony, the suspect was turned in by someone who read about the case in the newspaper. You never know what other people know. Another one was responsibility. Authorities were inhibiting the responsibility of the newspaper to let their community know when big events like that take place, and truthfulness. If you have to hide something, you're not being truthful. By trying to hide what was going on in that community, the authorities were lying about what was going on, henceforth, not being truthful. The philosophical principle of that story was assuming, and I quote, the publication would hamper and perhaps wreck their investigation, and that the Secret Service told us most passionately that publication of the story could bring about Bush's assassination by somehow goading on an obviously unbalanced suspect in action. The unethical effects were that it kept the perpetrator free longer by keeping the community in the dark. It could be interpreted that the authorities involved had the wrong set of priorities. They were more concerned about keeping it quiet to protect their own reputation rather than the news getting out so everyone knew. Some potential effects were that it caused people to not listen to authorities about publishing things like this story, and it caused publishers not to worry about the potential consequences, such as, quote, compelling a sick man to harm someone else, or if running the story will hinder the investigation. So the next one was another aiding law enforcement, and it was newspaper joins the war on drugs. A Standard Times publishes photos of all suspected drug offenders. So the unethical acts in this one were posting people's pictures without their permission, and according to an attorney who had been quoted in the article, was that it violates journalism ethics to photograph people only accused of the crime. And the types of ethical issues were fairness. The newspaper is reporting people who may be guilty. No one was convicted of the crime. And then the philosophical principle for this one was that the paper is unjust because they are not even protecting the victims, like those who may be wrongly accused, but parading around potential victims around for everyone to see while thinking they're just helping their community. Unethical effects are people are wrongly accused and suffer the consequences of being guilty by association, and the effects on its receivers is it can make people more sneaky, finding more ways to not get caught, and drug dealers can use people who may be known as the face while having the real runners operate in the background. And the resolution could be that the newspaper should only publish people who are actually convicted of a crime. So, moving on to sensitive news topics, killing news, responsible coverage of suicide. Some unethical acts is one paper made a public event out of it, and the type of ethical issue is privacy. They weren't sure how to run the story in a way that wouldn't make it a public event, and they have to consider how would the victim's family feel? Was it ethical to blast a teenager's death when he was obviously suffering? And some unethical effects is it can make people ashamed if it's blasted on the front page as a story as they're not feeling healthy mentally. And I think the resolution could have been that I think the main paper did it relatively fairly while it's not being listed as a front page story. However, they could have focused more on what you can do to help yourself if you're feeling that depressed. And they could have listed where to get help. The final sensitive news topic is a delicate balance. Mental breakdowns in news coverage. Some unethical acts in this story were naming the man who needed help mentally, and the type of media issue was privacy by naming him and ruining his reputation, and fairness. To quote the article, it was, if he was a drifter, would he have escaped public charges? The philosophical principle in this one was everyone is assuming the paper should not have let the story run with the man's name because it ruins his reputation and hurts his family when the man obviously needed some sort of mental help. And the person who ran the story, he said he ran it and put the man's name in it because he holds medical professionals to a higher standard, while the man was just a dentist. Some unethical effects were his reputation was ruined because of the story being ran, and his family now has a reputation around that town. The potential effects is people will not support his dental business anymore for fear that he will go crazy again, and people will not support that paper anymore due to their ethical call. I think a reasonable resolution could have been that the paper could have run the story but left out the man's name in it for his and his family's sake. They could have identified that he had a mental breakdown, and then they could have listed help options for other people who are feeling like they're being overloaded.